Okay, introduction to anatomy, body cavities. All right, so body cavity is a space in a body that holds organs. And here's a fish that's had its innards taken out so that we can see the body cavity. There are two major body cavities in a human, the anterior or ventral cavity and the posterior and or dorsal cavity. Anterior and ventral and posterior and dorsal are synonyms, of course. Here, the anterior or ventral cavity is colored red, whereas the posterior or dorsal cavity is colored yellow. The anterior cavity is divided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity by the diaphragm, which is a thin muscle inferior to the lungs and heart that helps us breathe. It goes all across the interior of the body like a complete shelf, right, below the lungs and the heart and above the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is divided into the right and the left pleural cavities and the mediastinum, an area in the middle of the thoracic cavity. The pleural cavities contain the lungs. The mediastinum contains the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart, and also the trachea, the esophagus, and major blood vessels like the aorta and the superior and inferior vena cava. Here's a cross or transverse section of the thoracic cavity showing the right lung, the heart, and the pericardial cavity, and the left lung, and then showing a frontal plane showing the lung, the heart, the lung again. Of course, that's the right and the left, heart in the middle. Here's the trachea, superior vena cava, the aorta. The abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity by an imaginary line. There's nothing there. There is actually an overlying sheet of peritoneum, like a membrane, but there's nothing like a muscle or anything dividing the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity contains the digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems, or at least parts of them. And now, talking just about the abdominal cavity and the area just posterior to it, there is within the abdominal cavity the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, kidney, and spleen. Some of these organs, as we will learn, are actually behind a membrane. So, for example, the kidneys are in the area of the abdominal cavity, but are actually behind a membrane. So not exactly, able to rub up against the stomach, small intestines, etc., but rather sequestered behind a membrane. But in any case, just for now, you can learn that the abdominal cavity and the area just posterior to it contain all these things, and that's correct. The pelvic cavity contains the bladder and the reproductive organs, including the ovaries, the uterus, and the prostate gland, and it also contains the rectum, the end of the large intestine. And here's a sagittal section showing the anterior or ventral cavity, the thoracic cavity with the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity with the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The posterior or dorsal cavity contains the cranial cavity and the spinal or vertebral cavity. And this cavity is divided by the foramen magnum, a hole in the base of the skull, into the superior cranial cavity and the inferior spinal cavity. The cranial cavity contains the brain, and the spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. So no surprise. Okay, so introduction to anatomy, abdominopelvic quadrants. All right, the abdomen and pelvis can be divided into four quadrants. the right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant by vertical and horizontal lines that are drawn through the umbilicus or belly button. Specific organs are found in specific quadrants. For example, the liver is in the right upper quadrant. The stomach is in the left upper quadrant. The appendix is in the right lower quadrant, and the sigmoid colon is in the left lower quadrant. Clinical correlation, when locating and diagnosing pain, injuries, or diseases, knowing the quadrants and their associated organs is useful. For example, appendicitis, an infection in the appendix, causes pain in the right lower quadrant where the appendix is found. Okay, so actually, the terms right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant are used clinically very often. Okay, introduction to anatomy, anatomical landmarks and major regions of the body. So anatomical landmarks are areas of the body that can be described and located precisely, and they include major regions of the body and also other regions. So anatomical landmarks, if you actually count up how many there are on these anterior view and posterior view of this man here, there are many, many areas. And almost all of them are useful in anatomy, okay, for learning the area and learning the word associated with the area. But especially helpful to learn are 20 major regions of the body. And Martini's has a nice table that shows the area of the body with the English or common name and the anatomical name, which is either in Greek or Latin. Okay. Often the Greek was turned into a Latin name, so there's kind of like a line. And of course, back in the Middle Ages, everybody who was learned spoke Greek or Latin, and they named everything in Greek and Latin to show how learned they were. And we're slowly moving away from that, but we're quite far from moving away from that completely. So you're going to have to learn a lot of Greek and Latin names while you study anatomy. It's just the way it is. Some may already be familiar to you. So the neck has an anatomical name of cervicis. And then the arm, in this example, the upper arm, which is called the arm in anatomy, the lower arm being called the forearm, is called the brachium. And then it's helpful to learn the word brachium means upper arm because multiple anatomical structures are named using brachium as part of their name. So the bicep brachii muscle, the tricep brachii muscle, and the brachial artery are all in the upper arm. And as we learn the muscles, we'll learn what the word biceps means, and what the word triceps means. And the whole thing, biceps brachii and triceps brachii, will be clear. But for now, just learn that brachium will show up in naming multiple structures. So become familiar with these areas. I crossed out some that I really don't see very much throughout your course. Leg being crus, calf being sura, foot being pes. However, if you want to learn them, fine, because I can't say that they'll never show up in your future. All right. Now, there are anatomical names that are nouns, and then there are anatomical names that are adjective forms. So the neck has a Greek or Latin name cervicis, and the adjective form is cervical. And now it's starting to look more familiar. So a neck injury might be described as a cervical injury. So any of you who've done any clinical work, you may have seen the word cervical injury or a person wearing a cervical collar because they had a cervical injury, things like that, right? And there's the picture as big as I can make it, so you can see the words as big as I can make it. And first of all start with the 20 before you 20 major regions of the body before you memorize all of them, because I know you want to. All right, so introduction to anatomy, anatomical names, single and plural endings, and eponyms. This is our last section. Yay. So most anatomical structures have an English or common name and a name that comes from Greek or Latin. And that means that you're going to have to learn single and plural endings for Greek and Latin names because they're different, just the way our language has different words for single things and plural things. Okay, hats, things, like that. The changes in the endings do follow certain patterns, and here's a big old list showing you the patterns. So we're going to learn a lot about epithelium, but when we talk about multiple epithelium, we're going to call them epithelia. Okay. You may have heard of mitochondria and not have realized that they're talking about several, or at least two, mitochondrion, right? And so on. Now the ums and the ons turn into an A. A's turn into, which would be pronounced Oz, turn into A's. So lacoon A turn into lacoon A. Phos A turn into phos A. A nucleus turns into nuclei. A vil-us turns into vil-I. A bronch-us turns into bronch-I. These do occur, and it's a little bit tricky. Just do your best to learn the words as they come up and to be sort of as clean as you can about it. I am in the process constantly of trying myself to really pay attention. And if I'm talking about multiple epithelium, to say epithelia. If I'm talking about one, to say epithelium. It's a challenge. I don't, claim to be a native Greek or Latin speaker, so just do your best. Now, sometimes the Latin words just add an S or an ES. So sometimes a word like plexus is just called plexuses, not plexi. And multiple aorta are called aortas, not aorti. This never comes up though. Neither does one penis being a penis and multiple penises being penises. In any case, it's there in case you ever need to use it. Okay, and then finally, eponyms. In the past, many structures in the body were named with eponyms, which means that they were named after the person that first described them. Now, eponyms have fallen out of favor in modern anatomy, and in this course, we will try to avoid them. However, some eponyms are so familiar and seem to fit the structure so well that they're a little hard to get rid of. And sometimes I will use eponyms without particularly meaning to, because I learned eponyms when I was learning anatomy, and then you will probably pick up the eponyms from me, and we will continue to use eponyms longer than we meant to. Martini's has a list of eponyms that are in common use, and you can look in the back of the book and see that list. All right, that is the end. So I will just point out to you that when you're in class, you will go down to the end of your lecture to find the lab. And here will be the instruction for the lab. On it will go, and then there will be the practice questions after it. Now, it's good if you read through the lab before you come to class. But then we always have plenty of time to do our actual labs. All right. During our first lab, I will do a little short lab introduction in which I will, put this up on the screens and talk to you a little bit about lab stuff because that belongs in lab. And then you will do a very small lab. That will be very fun. Bye for now.